So welcome to Mex Moves, our weekly podcast on Mexico business and finance. How are you, Eduardo?
I'm very well. I'm very happy, Damian.
I can imagine. Well, before we get to the World Cup, just a brief summary of what's in store. We have a great interview at the end of the podcast with Leandro Cuccioli. Leandro is the Senior Vice President of Strategy, M&A, Investor Relations, and so on at Mercado Libre, based here in Mexico. He's going to talk about Mercado Libre's opportunities and challenges. It's been a difficult year for the company from a stock market perspective, but it continues to grow very fast, especially here. And he'll go into some of the reasons behind that. And then, Eduardo, I think we should look at some more encouraging news on the economy, and then Shane Bound's kind of re-announcement on the focus on renewable energy. And then we have perhaps this upcoming IPO, if it happens, of Sinda, the silver company, silver mining company, which is still in the exploration stage. Does that sound good?
That sounds fair to me.
So actually, I got a listener, Eduardo, I hadn't mentioned this to you, called me up saying we were too relentlessly negative on Mexico and that we were falling into the trap of the sort of classic Mexico City chattering class being downbeat on this country. So I'm going to make an effort to be more upbeat this week. For example, he said that when we talked about education and its limits on Mexican growth, we failed to mention that Mexico factory workers, leaving aside what they get paid, are amongst the most productive in the world. They're very good at what they do, which is true, and I've seen that myself, and so on. So I think it's always good to listen to our listeners' feedback. And what better way to be positive than last night's result? Mexico 3, Czech Republic 0. Did you get a chance to see it? I imagine yes.
I did, and my son went to the game, and he says that it was incredible, unbelievable. So that has put the country in a good mood, I would say. I mean, I went to a friend's house and I took the Metro bus back home. That was more exciting than the game itself. Everybody in the bus was just incredibly happy, cheering, making kids jokes to the chauffeur, lighting up things, and it was fantastic. And it's great to see young people being so happy. They were obviously booing politicians, but what would you expect? But that gives us or at least it gives me a certain entry to talk about a bit of the economy numbers that we've had over the past few days that are, if not as exciting or as positive about Mexico's economic future. It does go well with the festivities that the World Cup is bringing to the country, and that might be even generating some economic positive fallout. The first indicator, and you saw it, Damian, was the IGAE, or this advanced number for how the economy is doing on a monthly basis. And it surprised everyone as the economy rose 1.2% in April from the month before in seasonally adjusted terms. And here again, following the comment from the listener, this is the third consecutive month-to-month rise and the fastest increase since March of 2021. That's more than 5 years ago. So maybe there is a pickup, or maybe not, but maybe there is a pickup on economic growth that might materialize even harder as the second quarter numbers come out. The World Cup numbers will be reflected in June, I suspect. So that's good news. Analysts were expecting an increase of just 0.7%. So the 1.2 rise in April was far above their expectations. And what is really interesting about the number as we go through its different components is that the manufacturing sector rose 2.1%, and that exceeded the increase of 0.7% in the service sector and offset the 0.4 decline in the agricultural primary activity. So Manufacturing, it's important that it grows. That's Mexico's one of its two most important engines. The service sector is also quite important because of tourism and other industries that are part of that sector. And so on that economic front, we are beginning to see a pickup that materialize even further with this World Cup. I don't know if you want to add anything, Damien, before I also go into the inflation that came out yesterday.
Yeah, I think obviously encouraging, and it was also broad-based, as you mentioned. Agriculture was up, nearly 5%. Industry was up, 1.8. Services were up 2.4. So there was it wasn't, narrowly focused on one area. I think it's obviously, and everyone would agree with this, mistake to focus just on 1 month's numbers. And we have some May numbers that are maybe not quite so encouraging. So ANTAD, same-store sales for May were just 0.08%. Supermarkets are only up 2.5%. Now, ANTAD is becoming less relevant because it doesn't include, as far as I understand, some of the large e-commerce companies like Mercado Libre, we're going to speak to later, and Amazon, and they're reporting, double growth in the 20s, 30%. So there's an interesting Substack on Mexico's economy, Ecomex, that I was reading about how the composition of retail sales are changing and going much more online, and maybe ANTAD, which historically has been this great bellwether of what's happening in the consumer sector. Maybe ANTAD is becoming a little bit less relevant than in the past. The other thing that maybe also isn't so positive is that the IMSS numbers, formal employment. There was a drop in formal employment in May of 29,000 jobs. And as a result of that, labor informality has been continuing to grow. It's now at 55.2% from 54.9% a year ago. So I think that the big increase in the minimum wage, which is, of course, to be welcomed, and the increase in Social Security contributions does, and I think it would be a mistake not to accept this, does have some negative implications for formality as it gets more and more expensive to put people in the formal area. And we've talked about this at length, but it is the unintended consequence of this, very significant minimum wage increases and Social Security contribution increases that Mexico's happening. But as you said, great that April was positive. Hopefully May will continue that trend, and hopefully the World Cup, especially if Mexico continues, wins in the round of 32, 16, maybe all the way to the final. If that happens, then for sure there'll be a boost to consumer spending, as well as to much more importantly the overall good humor of the Mexican people, who certainly deserve good news from when it comes to the World Cup.
Yeah, and the hopes are high. We will be playing in the Azteca Stadium all the way to the at least to the 2 next games if we win the next one. So there's hope for that. And on that note, as I said, the other good number was the inflation figure. It seems that the subsidies on energy prices in Mexico is working. Inflation for the first half of June decelerated 0.1% in those first 2 weeks of this month. And that's the biggest decline for the same period in 21 years. So a good number, and it left Mexico with an annual inflation rate of 3.6%, 3.55, 3.6%, which is within, as it has been over the past few 2 weeks, the central bank's inflation target range of between 2% and 4%. The analysts were expecting inflation to decelerate, but on an annual basis to 3.8, but it went even further than they were expected. So they were surprised by the decline. And I think, again, that's good news for consumers and good news overall for the country. I think the central bank will probably have a big sigh of relief as they've been cutting rates when people have been a little bit skeptical of how fast they should have gone. But it seems that they were on target, as inflation has, at least for now, been decelerating and confirming the thesis that the rates needed to be lower than they were a few months ago.
Yeah. So as everyone knows, I think inflation is divided into sort of the headline inflation, which is what people pay for their products, and then the core inflation, which strips out certain volatile products which are subject to seasonality. And the headline number, as you said, Eduardo, was very encouraging at 3.55, but it was driven down by these, especially by tomato prices. So tomato prices were down, I think, by 24%. And everyone in Mexico puts tomatoes on whatever they want to eat, so that has a sort of disproportionate impact on the headline. But fruits and vegetables overall were down 5%. So if you strip out these volatile factors, core inflation, which is I think what the Bank of Mexico focuses on when it decides what to do with interest rates, remains at 4.1%. So there wasn't a decline in core inflation, even if the headline number was very encouraging, and the headline number probably helps affect inflation expectations. So good news. The central bank will, almost definitely today, keep rates at 6.5%. I think overall, the fact that inflation, stayed the same during this sort of oil price hike, and that headline inflation came down, is a validation of the central bank's decision to cut rates, especially if you factor in that growth, until at least very, very recently has been, very disappointing. They came under a lot of flack from Bloomberg and other people for cutting rates. At least two members of the board were against the majority decision led by Victoria Rodriguez, the governor. I think now that we've had a few months of data since that controversy, we can, in the spirit of being positive this week about everything, we can say that the central bank called the interest rate correctly. Would you agree with that?
I would, Damian. I think like you said, it validates the performance. It's good to have a central bank that has different points of view, I would suspect. And in that sense, we should not be surprised that sometimes the decision is not unanimously. There are people with different points of view, but I think the ones that decided to cut rates have, with the way the inflation has behaved, they have been validated. And those that were a little bit less in favor of that or against it, well, it was good. I mean, the picture was not as clear as we're now seeing it, but it seems to be working. And I think they got help from the finance ministry by subsidizing gasoline prices and not letting that filtered into the rest of the way prices are built in this country and everywhere else, where energy prices are a key component of the pricing evolution and how people price their products and goods and services. So good for them. The central bank should, like I said, have a big sigh of relief after the numbers are coming their way.
So continuing with the positive news, Eduardo, the president had on her mañanera the energy minister, Luz Helena González, and the head of the CFE, Emilia Calleja, and they unveiled sort of yet again, because I think these two people have been on the mañanera many times, just sort of discussing some of the same things. But anyway, the latest re-announcement was 32 gigawatts of new generation capacity, and 22 gigawatts, so about 70%, will be renewable. So that's a much higher percentage than the stock of renewable is. So the overall share of renewable will be therefore growing. And that 22 gigawatt, I think 12.3 will be solar, 6.8 will be wind. There'll also be some geothermal. And then there's going to be 10 gigawatts of combined cycle kind of gas, which is obviously not renewable, but much cleaner than some of the existing kind of older CFE plants that use combustibile, like diesel, I guess. So we're moving into this higher share of renewable. If this happens, because it's obviously a lot easier to announce something in the morning press conference than actually do it. But I think we're moving in that direction. I think the goal here is to meet your climate change obligations, which Shanebaum from her academic work is deeply committed to. I think almost on a personal level. I think it's also to reduce the dependence on imported natural gas. Mexico, imports, maybe 70% of its electricity is generated by natural gas, which is overwhelmingly imported from the US, which is great for Mexico, to be frank, because that low cost gas keeps electricity prices under control. So Mexico is paying, maybe a third of what Europe pays for its gas because it gets to import it from Texas, where there's an abundance of gas thanks to the shale revolution. Now, it also, I think, marks and it's not the first time we've said this, but it's worth repeating. It marks an important change under AMLO, who in actions, at least, and probably in words, but didn't express it too clearly, was pretty skeptical about renewables. So he, as you probably remember, they changed these things called the CEL rule changes, that basically the CFE buy kind of old fossil fuel energy instead of the renewable energy that it was under these CEL rules was meant to have bought. And that was challenged in the courts, and in the end, a lot of renewable investment was cancelled or even abandoned as a result of the AMLO administration. So there is a change. Now the private sector and CFE will be doing this investment via mixed financing schemes. The CFE will be developing the large majority of the new capacity. They will be using kind of more flexible financing schemes to get the private sector to pay for some of it and for it not to lead to a sizable increase in CFE debt. So there'll be sort of a new equivalent or a modern equivalent of sort of public-private partnerships. So let's hope that this happens. Let's hope that renewable becomes a bigger part of Mexico's overall electricity generation. And let's hope that the private sector buys into these new sort of flexible financing schemes that are probably too complex to go into it on this podcast. Now, in fact, today, which is Thursday, Reforma has a sort of front page story about apagones, blackouts across Mexico. And Shanebaum said these are just interruptions rather than blackouts, because the problem isn't generation, but the problem is transmission, that Mexico doesn't have enough transmission lines. I don't think the verbal distinction is very relevant. Fact of the matter is that in addition to investing in the generation, what Mexico obviously needs to address in transmission, because the average company or the average household wants electricity and doesn't really care too much if the problem is transmission or generation. What they care about is whether it's arriving and what they're paying for it. But what's clear is that because of the data center revolution, which is very energy consuming, and Mexico's building its own data centers, Mexico, if it's going to participate in that, as it is participating in that, Mexico's along with Taiwan, is becoming the major sort of AI data center exporter to the US. It's going to have to increase its generation and transmission, and these are good signs. I think the idea is to have a very complementary generation sources, whether it's gas or whether it's wind or whether it's solar, so that Mexico isn't dependent on any one source, and over time meet some of its climate change obligations.
Yeah, no, I think this is a crucial element, and we heard last week from Pam Starr that the electricity sector was one of the places where Shanebaum could have some leeway and do things, and it seems like it is happening. I've also heard from sources within the industry that there is a lot of movement and trying to bring in this investment. I mean, Sheinbaum is worried about the decline in investment that Mexico has suffered over the past 18 or 24 months. So I think this is a sector which she could do it. As you say, the devil is in the details and whether they can bring the financing or hand out some of these projects to private investors in a quickly, orderly fashion so that companies can earn their profits and have viable businesses. That's all still in the works, but it looks like this is the sector where she can do a lot and she cares about the environment, at least from her academic years. And I think she's sincere about that. So we'll have to keep an eye on this, and hopefully they will be able to cajole all this financing and private enterprises that are very willing to participate in Mexico's electricity sector. It's one sector that needs a lot of investment, according to this Reforma report. A lot of these blackouts or interruptions, however you want to call them, are due because of lack of maintenance and so on and so forth. So there is a need for a lot of capital in the industry. So let's hope that Sheinbaum and the Energy Secretary are up to the task.
Indeed. So moving on to yet more good news, a potential IPO out of Mexico, although they won't, if the IPO happens, they won't IPO in the Mexican stock market. Sinda, which is a silver exploration company, they filed. Morgan Stanley is the global coordinator or lead left. The idea is to raise about $220 million on the New York Stock Exchange. And then in addition to that, there's a private placement subject to the IPO happening at the same price as the IPO of about $100 million with Fresnillo. Fresnillo, of course, is the subsidiary of Peñoles, the giant and Mexican silver company, the largest silver company in the world. And Mexico is, in fact, the largest silver producer in the world at a country level. And Fresnillo is the subsidiary that's listed in the London Stock Exchange. Now, Sinda is right now it's doesn't produce any silver, so it's an asset with reserves. It has a reserve base of about 370 million silver equivalent of ounces, and it's in or around Guanajuato, where Fresnillo has a lot of its own silver mines. And the idea is to continue to develop the reserve base, and then obviously eventually mine and produce the silver, mainly silver. What is interesting is that Mexico's been mining silver since basically the Spanish invaded the country, and they're still finding new silver vein structures. And this was identified as recently as 2016. So it's a relatively new discovery, and I guess technology has also improved to enable you to discover these reserves that previously perhaps you wouldn't have been able to find. Now, about 80% of this company is going to be, after the IPO, if it happens, going to be controlled by this interesting man, Thomas Kaplan, who has an entity called Electrum. And he has not one, not two, but 3 degrees from Oxford University, my alma mater, including a doctorate. But he's not at least he didn't study geology. He's worked more on history, and the role of conflict and of commodities in development of countries like Malaysia. Anyway, seems to be a billionaire. He was behind Apex Silver, which was associated with the Bolivia San Cristobal deposit. He built Leo Exploration, which he sold back in 2007 to Encana for $2.5 billion. So you've got this obviously very brilliant, quite contrarian sort of investor. He's going to get 78% voting control after the IPO. And then the other thing that I thought was interesting about it is that the CEO, the man running it is Daniel Muñez, and he used to be the CFO of Grupo Mexico, and he used to run Grupo Mexico's America's mining arm. I used to know him back in my banking days. And interesting that Peñoles, which is obviously the big rival to Grupo Mexico, is investing in this, which makes sense given it's silver based, but that all the top executives here in Mexico seem to be ex Grupo Mexico. So it's kind of a nice little rivalry going on there between Grupo Mexico and Peñoles. And I think Grupo Mexico likes to do things itself, so probably wouldn't want to give money to a startup mining company, whereas Peñoles seems to be a bit more open-minded.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, this Electrum group that this Oxford academic and now businessman has created, because it's Sinda is one of many companies, mining companies, that it's invested. I don't know if you did a little research, but I did, Damian, and they are quite the investment group in mining, specializing mainly in precious metal, obviously gold and silver, but they are also invested in mining companies that do base metals like copper, nickel, and zinc. Just to give you a few names of the companies that they are shareholders, at least they are invested in 26 mining companies. Most of them are traded on the stock market. One of them is Nova Gold Resources. That's a mining company that is developing the Donlin Gold project in Alaska. They seem to be investing a lot in companies that are in Alaska. Trilogy Metals is also another company that is mining copper, zinc, lead, cobalt, silver, and gold in Alaska. Hecla Mining, which is the dominant US and Canadian silver producer, that company produces close to 37% of all the silver that the US produces and about 29% of Canada's silver production. And in the Americas, Electrum is also invested in Pan American Silver, which produces gold, silver, zinc, copper, lead in mines across Mexico, Peru, Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. So this is quite a giant in mining, at least investing in companies. They don't obviously hold control of those companies, but they are playing the mining quite well. The IPO comes at a very reasonable time because mining companies have done very well over the past year. As we know, even though gold has come down a bit from the highs that it reached, but the gold and silver were doing quite well. And just for example, Fresnillo, the company that is owned by Peñoles, reported record annual profits last year of 2 billion, driven mainly by the 136% increase in silver and a 64% increase in gold prices. So I think Sinda is coming at the right time, in the right moment, and we'll see how it does.
Yeah, we should try and get Mr. Kaplan to come on the show.
Use your Oxford credentials.
Exactly. I'm actually the head of the Oxford Alumni Association in Mexico, just in case you had any questions about my extracurricular activities. We will extend him a formal invitation as someone with three Oxford degrees. As you say, silver is all the rage, right? I mean, it has been all the rage, a bit less this year. As a kind of hedge, as government debt goes through the roof, people want gold and silver as bonds. For some people, at least, are less attractive. Government bonds are less attractive. And then, of course, silver plays a role industrially in a lot of things that are doing well right now: solar panels, electric vehicles, right, AI infrastructure. So there's a sort of double demand for silver that's led to this massive rise. Now, Sinda doesn't today, it's a exploration to development story. So it's still got a long way ahead. It's still got to be before it actually becomes a producing mining company. But Daniel Muñez, who's not a geologist, he's a lawyer, in fact, is very experienced in managing businesses in Mexico when he worked at Grupo Mexico. So, and obviously Mr. Kaplan is probably the most successful kind of gold and silver entrepreneur in the Americas over the last few decades. So it's a good combination.
Yeah, that Sinda has even posted losses. I mean, it's all capital infusion, not is not a commercially viable mining company yet, and the goal is to be in 2030, from what I read. So they have their work cut out. Sounds like if you're investing in, it's a little bit like how do you call these blank check companies that you purchase something
The
that was
SPACs.
Exactly. It's not a SPAC, obviously, but it's a company with a track record, but it still works.
Yeah, it's a pre-revenue company. It's pretty common in mining. I
Yeah.
mean, basically, it's a way of them raising financing to go into the development stage and exploration stage. So moving to Pemex and Petrobras, did you get a chance to see this memorandum of understanding? Also something that we've read about before?
I did see that they finally reached this agreement where they will share a lot of knowledge and expertise, mainly from Petrobras to Pemex. It's not yet something that will interfere, will allow the Petrobras to be a player in the oil industry on its own, but I guess it's a tiny little step taken by Claudia to open or to change her ideology in terms of the oil industry and how protected she is about it, and it should be run by the state. But I think coming from a country where the political system or the political party in power is a bit like hers on the left, I think she felt a little bit more comfortable to reach this agreement. And it's a lot about exchanging data and resources to be able to come up with ideas and probably prospects later on. What did you make out of it, Damian?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it's good news that Pemex is reaching some kind of understanding with Petrobras, because I think it's got a lot to learn from Petrobras, especially in deep water exploration, mature field recovery, seismic reprocessing. I mean, there's certain areas, especially deep water, that Petrobras has become very, very, very good. So if Pemex is able to get some of that know-how, that's great. Secondly, politically, I think clearly with both Peru in the last few weeks and Colombia moving to the right, we have basically Mexico and Brazil are the last two countries, also the biggest two countries that have left-wing governments, and I think they're sort of trying to get closer as they get surrounded by right-wing governments in Latin America, and of course Trump in the US. So I think there's a big political element. Third, the divergence in fortunes between Petrobras and Pemex over the last decade is I think very illuminating, and I think anyone who's willing to look at data and evidence has to conclude that Petrobras model for a state-controlled oil company is superior to the Pemex's. And Petrobras's model obviously is having a company quoted in the stock exchange with a minority stake in the stock market, and Petrobras is subject to the discipline of the market and minority investors, even if the state picks the chairman and the CEO and sets the overall guidelines. So 2016, Pemex and Petrobras roughly produced the same amount of oil, about 2.2 million barrels per day. Since then, Petrobras has gone up to 2.4, 2.5, I think, and Mexico's gone all the way down to 1.5 and 1.3 if you take out oil condensate. So you've seen a very dramatic decline in Pemex, but at the same time, Pemex's costs haven't declined, so the profitability has collapsed, since the profitability of the exploration production was the key part of the value chain at Pemex. So if Petrobras coming to Mexico and Pemex going to Brazil helps Petrobras eyes Pemex, that would be great. And if it helps change people like Shane Bound's thinking about how to run Pemex, that would also be great. Whether this actually leads to transformation and change, it's really unknowable at this point. It's just a memorandum of understanding, but I think it's a positive development, and it's something that we should be looking at. And Petrobras has also had its challenges in Venezuela and other places growing outside Brazil. It's a far more efficient company than Pemex is, but it's not as efficient as as the big global oil majors. It's still also subject to a lot of political interference. So it might be a nice political partner for Pemex, but probably even better partner would be the oil majors. But they're not, I think, as things currently stand, very interested in working in Mexico. They've got plenty of other places where they can work, where the regulatory regime is more friendly than Mexico's is. And in the end, every dollar invested in Mexico is a dollar not invested in Venezuela or in the Middle East or wherever it might be. So they're not coming to the table. And Petrobras, precisely because it is subject to political control, and because Lula and Sheinbaum want to keep this kind of left nationalist Latin American alliance amongst a sea of right-wing governments, is willing to do it. So you take what you can choose in this world.
Yeah, I think that's correct. There is also, Venezuela, even though it's still not clear how its oil industry is going to develop, but apparently the big oil companies have changed a little bit their view, and they're beginning to look at it in a serious way. So there is more competition coming out of of another oil-producing nation. So Pemex has to up its game, and it's gonna be hard due to all the limitations that the current model is showing. But hopefully, with this little step that Claudia took with the memorandum of understanding with Petrobras, it signals that there might be something there in the future.
And just to finish, two snippets from me. High Ventures, the AI-focused venture capital fund in Mexico, put out a report, which I recommend. You can see it on the High Ventures website, on how AI is being adopted in Mexico and Latin America. One of the co-founder of High Ventures, managing partner, and my friend Federico Antoni, chatted me three main conclusions, which I'm going to read out. Thank you, Federico. First of all, AI agents have arrived. 62% of startups in Latin America are piloting or deploying AI agents. So the conversation has shifted from AI adoption to complete kind of reorganizational design. Second, Mexico has a major execution opportunity. AI use is widespread. 93% of corporates are using it, but only 24% have deployed it at scale. So the challenge is no longer kind of using AI, but transforming how companies operate. And then finally, AI is becoming the default way to build and invest in Mexico and Latin America. 99% of startups, 98% of VC firms using AI to drive their processes, their investment decisions. So we've got interesting study, goes into a lot more detail. I had a chance to look at it this morning. Strongly recommend it. And then secondly, UBS, where I spent 19 years and a bit of my professional life, put out a report on family offices. They surveyed 307 family offices across 30 countries. Average net worth was high, by my standards at least, $2.7 billion. And in those 307 family offices, there were a bunch of Latin American family offices. And I think a couple of sort of conclusions, which is Latin America has a much higher share of sort of dynastic companies, as you would expect. So basically one generation handing over the company to the next generation. So globally, 45% of family offices involve the next generation. And in Latin America, that's 56%. And then in terms of when it comes to investing, Latin America, billionaires are more conservative. They have less alternatives, venture capital type investments, and more fixed income type investments. And then thirdly, they invest, as you would expect, given the volatility in Latin America, they invest a lot less in their home market. So only 23% of their liquid assets are invested in Latin America, whereas in the US and Europe, most of the assets are invested in the home market. Also, you could get that on the UBS website.
Very interesting. Shall we move to the interview?
Sounds good. So it's a great pleasure to have with us again Leandro Cuccioli. Leandro is the Senior Vice President at Mercado Libre, and among various things, he oversees corporate development, strategy, sustainability, investor relations. And we had Leandro on Mex Moves exactly a year ago, and he's our first long-form interviewee to return. Leandro, how are you today?
Damian, at first, I'm astonished that it's been a year. And I think it's a sign of me getting older that years are going very, very fast. So I would have not guessed it was a year ago, but great to be back.
So Leandro, in that year, and our focus, as you know, is Mexico. Although feel free to talk about Mercado Libre at a regional level if it's pertinent. Mercado Libre has posted, really remarkable growth. Just looking at the Mexico numbers for the first quarter, I think your total revenues, which includes financial income, was about $2 billion. That was up maybe 62%. Your e-commerce revenues were up 50% at 1.2 billion. Fintech was 780 million, 76% up. And your direct contribution was also up nearly 60%. So extraordinary numbers. At the same time, Mercado Libre, the stock, has been, I think it's fair to say, a poor performer. It's down about 30% maybe over the past 12 months in a period where NASDAQ, has been hitting all-time highs. Mexico and Brazil have both been performing well. So how do you square the circle? How do you explain, Leandro, this very strong performance, not just Mexico, but also very big revenue growth in Brazil and Argentina, and yet this very weak stock price compared to other market indices?
I would say even the dislocation is more stark than that, because the decrease in price of the last 12 months has been 33%, and it's 12% year to date. And you're absolutely right, with results that are mind-blowing, to put it in a way, right? Because revenues grew the last quarter at 49%. 49% of a company that is 27 years old. I think and we can talk about Mexico. I think the issue with the stock has been, in the short term, an issue of expectations, really. I think the investment drive that we've gone into Brazil in particular has meant that, and we've said it very openly, that in the short term, we were willing to sacrifice profits for long-term gain and maximization of cash flow. So if you look at our margins, and you look at the stock from very afar, say, well, wait a second, these guys were earning 15% EBIT 2 years ago, and now they're at 7. Can you explain me why is that a good idea? And I think that, and probably it's us, that we could do better in communications. I lead IR, so it's up to me. But I think the size of the opportunity ahead of us has been underestimated by the market. So I think that when the weakness of the stock is because people are saying, wait a second, if now they're making 7% instead of 15, this is a smaller, in a way, cash flow pool, and I need to adjust for that. And we see quite the contrary, actually, that what we are doing is to maximize the long-term cash flow pool by several times of what we had before. So it's a question of perspectives. Nobody that I've talked in the investment community disagrees with what we are doing in the long term. I think that there's been questioning around how low these margins can go before they come back. And in that expectation, particularly with the sell side, because we don't guide, but the sell side has had expectations in which, if you look at the last 4 or 5 quarters, it's been this kind of game, in a way, in which we overshoot their expectations in revenue, but we undershoot their expectations in EBIT. And I think it's the market now, I think, has come more to a the right level of expectations, in my view, for the year and next. So I think that, and I need to say it because and that's my function. I think it's a great buying opportunity, Mercado Libre. Probably was 2 weeks ago was better than now because it's at more than 1,700 and it was at 1,500. And I don't have a doubt that, the company is performing extremely well. But yeah, there is a dislocation. For the people that look at the short term, it hasn't been easy for sure in the last few months.
So as you mentioned, the big problem from a margin perspective, seems to be in Brazil, where you gave more, free shipping and so on, and Mexico, based on the direct contribution numbers, has held up pretty well. And I guess the question is, should we expect Mexico to kind of follow the Brazil path and you to extend more and more benefits to your Mexican customers to grow the market? Or do you think Mexico margins will actually be pretty resilient?
I think that in the short term, I don't see going the same path of Brazil. But I always say that retail per se, I mean, the bigger the market, the more competitive it is, right? And retail per se in Brazil, and to a lesser extent in Mexico, but it's always going to be very, very competitive with low margins. The question is whether we're going to be able to monetize the marketplace through ads and the fintech side, right? And that's why I'm bullish about Mercado Libre as a whole, because I think that on retail, you're always going to have the next thing. It could be the free shipping threshold, then it's going to be quick commerce or whatever. There's always something that comes after that requires capital, and it's a low margin business, right? It's a tough business to be in, retail in general. So while I don't see the same levels of Brazil, because I think the market is different, particularly the presence of Asian players, the presence of Amazon is different here in Mexico is a very strong presence, the one of Amazon, given their integration with the US. I don't think it's the same in Brazil. Brazil, I think, saw the local retailers retrench quite a lot. You don't see the same here. I think you still see Liverpool and Walmart being forces, particularly online, and doing very well. So I don't think you can equate one market to the other. But that being said, in the longer term, I do see these frictions of free shipping, etc., being progressively removed. Because every time that we do that, or we issue credit cards, or whatever we do to bring more people online and shop, we see that there is amazing payback. And, only one stat that I've been using a lot recently, but I think it, for me, is the most interesting one of all the ones we have. A consumer in Mercado Libre shops 10 times a year, 11, call it. In the US, an Amazon consumer shops 50. So there are 5x transactions. Forget about the value of those transactions because, difference in GDP per capita and all that stuff. But how many of those instances of shopping are we capturing from families in Mexico or in Brazil? It's still very tiny. So, and why is that? Because you still don't have the right access to credit and payments and logistics, etc. So we're going to be in the middle of this drive to bring more people into the market for a long time. And that's probably what, going back to your previous question, I think that some people fail to see that we are in the early innings, like in the USA, of a market here, right? And we will need to invest for a long time in order to unlock that market. But the market that we're unlocking is several times larger than what people think. And that's what we are very convinced and what drives our strategy.
So you said that you thought Mexico was unlikely sort of to go down the Brazil route because Amazon was stronger in Mexico than Brazil, and the incumbent retailers, Liverpool, Walmart, Coppel, and so on, are sort of stronger in Mexico, more consolidated than in Brazil. Why would that lead Mexico to being a more attractive market if you have stronger competitors?
I guess that it's not the same. I think that the big disruption that this market of Brazil has had is having Asian players coming and establishing themselves in the country with a large presence. And I think there was a vacuum, if you ask me, there, in which we were doing very, very well, but there was no clear second like we have here in Mexico with Amazon. So I guess that I'm saying this is an attractive market, as is Brazil, but the reality is that I don't see for an Asian player the same level of the same conditions that you had in Brazil to come and disrupt, because here you have many more players that are doing things very, very well. I think in Brazil there was a vacuum, if you ask me, between us and the rest. And I think they found a very interesting niche that then it became not such a niche and became an important part. The other thing as well is that, these, strategies evolve, adapt. So I think it's, probably in some of these markets, it's going to be more difficult for them to replicate the playbook, given that the other, players are adapting. So that's why I don't think that you can compare one to the other. In particular in Brazil as well, we need to take into account that, it's the bulk of our issuance of credit cards. So the numbers that you're seeing now in Brazil are particularly depressed by the provisions of building our credit card business, which it will go away eventually, right? When you have more cohorts that are positive and all of that we can explore. So there are some situations that are more structural and some situations in Brazil that I will more of the short term that I think explains the difference.
So since we spoke, and thank you for that, Leandro, I guess there have been at least three kind of relevant developments in Mexico. One, there seems to be a consumer slowdown that has affected many of the traditional retailers that have seen their same-store sales growth decline. Second, Mexico has raised tariffs on Chinese imports, which have a decent market share in the Mercado Libre marketplace. And third, at the end of last year, Mexico increased quite significantly withholding taxes on sellers in all marketplaces in particular, but obviously you're dominant in marketplaces, so presumably it affects you more than others. Could you just go through, and yet you've seen your growth rate, even in constant currency terms, up by 50% or so. Could you go through how those issues have affected you and why we don't appear to see much sort of significant effect in your top line numbers?
Well, the three of them, I think if I start by the last one did affect, the first quarter of this year. If you look at our GMV, or gross merchandise volume transacted in Mexico, grew by 28% in the first quarter, which is an amazing, figure, I understand. But compared to where we were up, about 30. And I think that, we explained it very clearly, that was the effect of this withholding tax, in which I think at the end, Mexico and most emerging markets is a nation of SMEs, right? And, when you get the withholding tax of several percent on your revenue, the main problem that it creates is a working capital problem, right? Forget paying the taxes, you don't have the working capital. And I think that meant that a lot of merchants had to pass through that to prices, but in one channel, that is the online channel, right? And not 1P, it's 3P. So the difficulty of what was implemented is that it creates an uneven playing field between the different ways of selling offline and online, and then online, right? Between 1P and 3P. So if it's my inventory or inventory from third parties. So I guess that impacted us, in the first quarter. I think that the situation will eventually normalize. It doesn't change the overall dynamics of a market that, in a weak, going back to your second point, in a weak consumer environment, what we see in general, and we saw it in Argentina as well, that in a weak consumer environment, marketplaces have become a very interesting shelter for consumers in order to seek for the best price, the best financing, etc. Right? It's like if you are, a little bit short of money and you need to buy something, you're going to walk down the street and compare different shops. Well, the marketplace does that for you. And that's why marketplaces in a situation of weak consumer environment, of course, we're not immune, but we have, in a way, we're a little bit counter-cyclical there because more people try to come online and compare and try to get the best deal. And if you have the best prices and the best financing, as we do, I think that there we shelter a little bit from that weak consumer environment. That's the way to explain, how two types of company can be living in the same country, and one is reporting same-store sales growth of 2 and the other one of 28. On the Chinese tariffs, I think there has been, since the beginning of 24, clearly it has become, the world is more frictioned in a way, right? So business models that were predicated on bringing stuff from overseas have struggled to grow. They have a place in the market, but if you look at the share of those Asian businesses that are bringing stuff from China and how much they have of the Mexican market, that has not moved a lot in the last couple of years. They have moved, who the players are, but on aggregate, it has not moved a lot because basically, I think it's very hard to scale when, all the things that you said are happening, right? It's not only more tariffs, it's more friction in customs, etc. Now if you buy from the US as well, you need to put your RFC, and and some people don't have it or don't want to give it. So it has become more frictious. That's why I'm telling you that. I mean, going back to the previous question, is that if an Asian player wants to really gain market share in Mexico, we need to establish itself in Mexico and buy from Mexican sellers. And that what we saw in Brazil happening. But here, I think there is far more competition today than it was in Brazil, or you have more stronger players that would make that Asian player life more difficult in a way to do the same. That's why I'm tying the two things.
Understood. In the question of the withholding tax, I mean, from the government's point of view, and I believe in a previous job, well, I know in a previous job you were the chief.
I ran the tax authority in Argentina.
Yeah.
I was the taxman of Argentina.
So you might be uniquely qualified in the entire universe to answer this question, as very few people have worked in tax collection and in e-commerce. So the question is, right now, under this retention, you're disincentivizing people selling on marketplaces or 3P. Because they're going to have to pay tax on sales, which they can then use against their tax bill later on. But as you said, there's a working capital impact, and Mexico doesn't always return your taxes in a timely or fair fashion. On the other hand, if people move to selling in informal markets or unregulated online marketplaces like WhatsApp or whatever it might be, the government would lose a lot more money because they wouldn't get VAT, and they obviously, in many cases, wouldn't get the end of the year tax that is due on the income tax. So what are you doing, or what is Mercado Libre doing, or what is the Association of E-commerce doing to convince the government that this is a counterproductive tax measure? And do you have any expectation that there could be some kind of modification?
Well, I guess you're right that, I was the head of the tax authority in Argentina for 2 years, and I faced this situation because I remember having Argentina at the time. Now it had removed several of them, or some, but it had a lot of these withholding taxes mechanisms, right, for VAT, for income tax, etc. And why? Because for the tax authority, it's a very efficient way of collecting taxes, right? I mean, you collect it at the transaction. So you don't need to wait then for, in the other extreme, and sorry for the digression, but the Japanese tax authority, they don't even ask you to do the invoices that we do in Mexico through, electronic invoicing and all of that. You do everything on paper, and once a year you come with a bunch of invoices to the tax authority and you say, look, I earned this money, I owe you so much. Well, that doesn't work in Latin America, right? Unfortunately, different society, we can go, to, history itself. But the reality is that if you don't do something to get part of the tax that you're owed at the moment of the transaction, it's very difficult then to collect it. And then, of course, you can blame the tax authority for being inefficient, and we can have a very philosophical debate. So I understand why some of these things are done around the world. It's not that Mexico discovered them, but the reality is exactly as what you said. What you do in a way, if you're pushing people to the informal sector. So you are trading a short-term tax collection objective, which in the short term will work, right? Or you will see a bump in your revenue, with a more structural push for these merchants to go and sell in the gray economy, and that is what we've been, as an association, trying to make very clear, that this short-term policy objective could be jeopardized in a longer-term bigger objective. Now, it's very hard for me to opine on policy on any country and to say whether it's going to be reverted or not. But I think that we need to be cognizant of the effect that it has. We saw it in our numbers. And our numbers is not because it's our numbers. It's the reflection of a wider sector issue. Hopefully things at a certain point will change. But the reality is that this conundrum is being faced by several tax authorities in Latin America. We've seen it before.
So if we move to fintech and Mercado Pago, a year ago, you were pretty excited about Mercado Pago and about it potentially becoming a bank and about it potentially becoming the principal sort of financial intermediary for significant numbers of your customers. Since then, Nu has become a bank, or more or less. Plata's become a bank. Klar has bought, obviously, Bineo. Revolut has become a bank. And as far as I know, Mercado Pago remains a wallet, an IFPE, and has just applied also for a license for managing funds, mutual funds mostly. Why is it taking so long? What's gone wrong? When do you expect Mercado Pago to get its bank in Mexico?
Well, it's very hard to predict regulatory times. I think it would be extremely, brave on my side to give you a date and then come back next year. And now you asking me the obvious question of what that date was not fulfilled. I don't think there is nothing wrong. I think that we are probably a more complex structure than a pure play entity. Remember, we have the marketplace and we have other things. So I guess that there's nothing wrong with the regulator, and we remain very optimistic about the license. Is that I think it takes more time because all the other cases that you mentioned are, you're just a bank, and in our case, we're a marketplace. There is a lot of interlinkages between the marketplace and Mercado Pago that make the ecosystem, right? The competitive advantage of Mercado Libre is not the logistics or, the credit card or whatever good prices in isolated mode. It's everything together. And I think that takes more time just to figure out how to bring that into the structure of that is needed by regulatory standards to become a bank. So it's been a very open dialogue and back and forth, and we still have all the trust that we're going to get the license. But even, going back to where I was last year and where I am this year, of course, we want to become a bank because it allows us to unlock some products that are important longer term, right, in terms of our value proposition. But even without becoming a bank, and going back to your example of the $2 billion of revenue in the first quarter for Mercado Libre, that's for the whole Mercado Libre, $2 billion in Mexico. And that was 62% growth year on year in US dollars. But if you look at fintech, Of those 2 billion is 780, you said it, it's fintech. And that grew at 76%, right? So, the top line at 62%, this subset at 76, which shows you that even without becoming a bank, I'm equally excited as I was last year on the opportunity, because basically, in everything that you look across Mercado Pago, we are single digit market share of whatever, right? I mean, credit cards and, TPV or processing volume in offline payments, you name it, right? So the opportunity, as I always say, in Mexico is immense, because I still see a market in which the top 5 banks, control 80% of the deposits and the credit, where in Brazil is 60 or 55, I think now. So there is a lot of disruption to do, and there are a lot of cash transactions to bring to the electronic fold. So I don't remember exactly what I said last year, but it would not be very different from what I'm saying now. I'm sure I said last year that this is the biggest opportunity that Mercado Libre has as a whole, and I would say that continues to be true, even a year after growing at 76%. So hopefully next year when we meet, if I'm coming back, you invite me back, then we will have the license. But if we don't, there's still a lot of growth to conquer. So hopefully we'll have it.
Do you think any of the incumbents are sort of encouraging the authorities to slow down your bank application? Do you believe in any conspiracy theories, or is it just the authorities taking their time to understand your business?
I don't think. I mean, if they're doing some of those things, I'm sure I'm doing it not only for us. But no, I think it's as I said, it's we are a different beast, and I've seen the best approach from the authority, and it's been very collaborative. It's just that I think it's of a different kind than a pure plain banking license. So I will leave the conspiracy theory to the conspiracy theorists, but I don't think there is anything out there. It's just a matter of time.
And I don't really understand why you didn't buy Bineo. You could probably bought it for $50-100 million, and you bought Metro Cubico for something around that. Surely, as a drop in the ocean for a company the size of Mercado Libre, and surely it would have speeded up your process of becoming a bank. Did you take a look? Was there any reason why you didn't want to buy it?
Yeah, I'm this was before my time. So I arrived to Mercado Libre when we were already in the application. I think at the time, because I asked the same question, right? I mean, internally. And I think that one thing, Damian, that happens to us, and the same in other markets, is that while some of these banks may be cheap, the integration that we thought we had to do in order to scale from a technical point of view meant that, from our perspective, given that we were not in a rush, it was better to build it from the inside and not to speed up potentially the license, but then having a big problem in integration blocking the scaling. And also you need to understand also history. Here is a company that we are very proud of what we have built ourselves. Every time that we erred on the side of building something instead of buying it, and we can go to the logistics moment in which we decided to create our own warehouse management system and all of that, which was very counter logical to what people were saying. Go and buy it from the market, get something, just off the shelf. That allowed us to scale 30, 40, 50 times since then. And we look at the things that we try to buy with the same lens, right? I mean, maybe we're solving a short-term problem, but we are creating a long-term one. And I think that with the banks, and it's my understanding that we look here in Mexico, we never could square this kind of equation. And we said, look, we're not in a rush. Why don't we go and build it from the scratch and apply for the license? There's no more mystery than that, really. And it's debatable, right? I mean, when with the rear view mirror, Monday morning quarterback, and as they say in the US, probably, you look at it and say, well, it took more time. But I think that over the long term, 1 quarter, 2 quarters will not make a difference. What will make a difference if you can scale 30, 40 times.
So you mentioned the 780 million for Mexico fintech just in the first quarter. So, probably, you'll be over, 4 billion in revenues by the end of this year or more than that. But it's quite kind of different fintech revenues all bundled into one, right? You have the acquiring business, like Block, you have the wallet like PayPal, you have online payments like Stripe, you have credit cards like Synchrony, and then you have credit, buy now, pay later, I guess, sort of inside the e-commerce business, and also credit to the merchants. So these are very different businesses, and you only really break it down into two levels, as far as I can recall: payments and credit. Have you thought about giving a bit more disclosure now that fintech in 2026 is very different to fintech to 2022, so people can actually understand your fintech business?
It's always a debate with parts in the market that, for sure, and I've been on the buy side for a long time, you always want more, and I understand that. I think that we try to, and it's logical, try to balance that with, try not to show more than what we should for competitive reasons. I think we've been but we are constantly looking at what is the right level of disclosure. And in fact, sometimes it's not that you disclose something every quarter, but you give the market some kind of data point to reassure the market on a certain trajectory. And we've done that, and we will continue to do it. So kind of the answer is yes and no, in a way, because no, as in we're not thinking of changing dramatically our disclosure, but yes, in that we understand that investors need sometimes data points to make sure that you're moving in the right trajectory, particularly in the credit side, right? So we've been very vocal around the percentage of cohorts in the credit card being already positive. We've been very vocal around how we see NIMAL over time, and where we see the credit card performing. And we've been very vocal around the fact that we think that the credit card, is already almost half of the portfolio and will continue to, increase in share. And we also said that we're very pleased with the results in Mexico. So I think that over the next quarter, stay tuned, because we're going to be continuously, putting some tidbits of data there to make sure that investors feel comfortable, as we feel, that we are scaling the book responsibly. And then it's always a balance with, once you put something out there on a continuous basis, you need to commit to do it for the long term. So you need to think about very carefully about what you say and what you don't say.
No, I get it. I guess going back to something you said earlier in the conversation, the e-commerce business at an EBIT level is almost zero margin. So all the profit is coming from the fintech business broadly defined, from the advertising business, from membership fees and so on. So not giving kind of disclosure on what are the profit drivers of the company might make it a challenge for people to value it, because obviously $1 of revenue in payments or in a credit card or in a wallet, commissions or interchange or buy now, pay later is worth a different amount of money, because the margins are so different between those various financial businesses you have. So given that the e-commerce business is practically zero sort of EBIT at a consolidated level, seems to me giving a bit more disclosure would give more comfort and then warrant a higher valuation. But that's just a non-expert's opinion.
No, it could be, and it's debatable. And again, nothing of this is written in stone. So we may, at certain point, adapt, as we adapted so many times in the past. If you look at what we disclosed 10 years ago, it's very different from what we disclose now. So I'm not saying never. But the going back to my comment, I think that in markets that are very competitive, like Brazil or in China, the underlying retail margin is slim. I don't think that's the case everywhere for Mercado Libre, right? So I want to make sure that that is well understood, because there are other markets in which structurally you will not have the same level of competition, and there I think you can make more money without ads and without fintech. But in any case, my thesis to investors have been, well, assume the worst, assume that it's like that, right? Assume that retail is a very slim margin everywhere. Even in that scenario, with advertising and with fintech, I think that you can have a profit pool that is several times larger than what we're having today. And you're right. If at certain point we feel that there is more need to give, information to properly value the company, if we feel there is a dislocation, we will do it. I don't think that today, if we had more disclosure, it will affect dramatically where are we valued. I think we're valued at the point because of, people trying to get their head around on, what is this combination between overall margin and size of the profit pool that they need to think about, given that you had a contraction of margin from 15 to 7. So people are asking us, well, is the next step 0, or you will go back to 15, right? People want to input things in their Excel, which is completely logical. And, what we're going to show them over time is that this was worth it. And this was the best buying opportunity in a long period of time to buy Mercado Libre. But, let's see in a year.
2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, yeah.
So let's go to AI, which I know is a subject you, like everyone, but you more than almost everyone, follow very closely. I guess AI has at least, 3 impacts and maybe many more. One is how your customers shop. And last year we talked about AI agents shopping on behalf of customers and maybe disintermediating platforms like Mercado Libre. Second, there's AI, how it can make your company more efficient internally, and by exploring data more efficiently, targeting loans more efficiently, reducing customer service if agents could take their jobs. You name it, and I'm sure you'll go through some of the factors. And then thirdly, maybe through M&A, which, as you mentioned, with respect to fintech, Mercado Libre hasn't been particularly active, but maybe with this new revolution in the world's economy, it might change the way you think about things. So why don't you go through how you're thinking about those 3 areas with respect to Mercado Libre and Mexico, to the extent that Mexico is a special case?
Yeah, I don't think Mexico is a special case in this. I think it's a little bit of a global thing or regional thing. And I was when you were asking the question, I was thinking, how did I feel in June 2025 about these things? How do I feel now? And what was the threat at the moment? And it at the moment it was like ChatGPT was about to conquer us all, right? And just basically leave Mercado Libre, the Mercado Libres of this world, as just a logistics company that would, basically deliver the packages that you bought in ChatGPT. And the reality has been, like everything. I mean, Bill Gates said something that I think it's amazing, is that we tend to overestimate the change in the short term and underestimate the change in the long term. I think it happens all the time, right? So over the last 12 months, it has been proven that these change in the way people shop is not as easy as just creating a chatbot and then off you go. You're going to have a lot of customers buying in your platform. There is a lot that takes to create an e-commerce transaction and for people to trust you, right? Marketplaces have been working very, very hard for a long time, 20 odd years, to create all the elements that probably are not very sexy, like fraud detection and returns and buyer protection program and all those things, and logistics that really don't make the headlines sometimes. But those are the different elements that make someone to put their credit card and say, look, I trust you that over a screen I'm buying something. So in the short term, I think, and you've seen it with the U-turn that OpenAI did with their instant checkout, which they integrated with Etsy and Walmart, but then clearly that didn't get traction, and it didn't get traction because all these things that you need to solve are not easy. Now, that being said, going back to the Bill Gates comment, you cannot underestimate the change in the long term in how people shop. I don't think, even in the long term, that I'm seeing a world in which we're all in, I always say, white tunics, and someone is buying everything for us, and we do nothing, and we're like in Greece in whatever 3000 before Christ. I don't think that's because shopping has it's a great leisure activity, right? I mean, for some things like toilet paper, sure, right? But in a lot of other categories, you want to be involved in the shopping, right? You don't want to give it to an agent. So I think that, life is going to be kind of in the middle, but you need to prepare as a marketplace for more disruption to come, even if in the short term, it's becoming more difficult to do than what probably people thought. Now, that means that you need to develop your own features inside Amazon or inside Mercado Libre to retain the position that you have fought so hard to have, which is to be at the center of the life of your consumers. If you're in Latin America and you start a search for a product, probably a lot of people start in Meli, right? And in Amazon in the US. And that's what you want to retain. So the focus has been and continues to be how we keep that for ourselves in a way that the customer does not start elsewhere and starts in Meli. And in order to do that, you need to vastly improve your search, your capabilities to understand the context, to understand the data, to hyper-personalize the experience in a way that people feel that, oh, these guys know me, right? Basically, I don't know how they do it, but if I'm searching for something, I feel that they are bringing the right products for me. These people know me, because not everything is conversational, right? Some of the things you want to do conversational, but in some other things you don't want to have a conversation. You just want to go and type something and get the right product. So I think that today, if you see everything that is around e-commerce, everyone is very much focused on this kind of engagement and discovery, and making sure that through LLMs we bring the best search experience to the people so they don't go away from Mercado Libre. And we did in the first quarter, we rolled out LLM-based search in several of our markets, including Mexico, and the conversion is very different, right? And no wonder that when you are shown better products, you convert, right? And that also impacts your ads business that grew 73%, because the ad that you're showing to that person is more valuable because that person has a better intent of buying. So I guess that 1 year later, we are probably not underestimating the threat and the opportunity long term, but we are probably more appreciative as an industry of the challenges in the short term. Now, I think if I go back to 1 year and we imagine our world without Claude Cowork, I think that that's where I've seen a major shift in productivity, right? And still we are in the middle of something very interesting this year, which I think is every one of us are becoming far more productive at an individual level, but the firm is not, equally productive as a whole, right? So I may say, look, I do 3 times the things that I did before. Is Mercado Libre or any other company doing 3 times the things? No, probably not. Because like in any chain, there are links, and probably your link is being very productive, but there are other links that in the value chain that are not being as productive. And that is determining the productivity of the whole system. So we are in a moment in which is very interesting, because Claude Cowork has changed basically we have a rollout of 31,000 people of Claude Cowork inside the company. So basically everyone that is not an employee in one of our warehouses has Claude Cowork today. And we are one of the large rollouts of Claude Cowork around the world. And I can tell you that in my teams that I have, 60 odd people in Mercado Libre, the productivity gain of being able to have something that in a way takes control of all your work and connectors and skills, etc., is nothing compared to what we had a year ago, in which when I came to this podcast, we were working with N8N, trying to create these flows that were very cumbersome, and it was not easy. There was a lot of friction. So for me, in productivity, there's been the biggest change in the last 12 months, right? In which today you can really see how you can create agents and have, as a manager, a fleet of agents and people there. So I guess that eventually we're going to see the change in the consumer side. Remember when I came last year, we didn't have a Mercado Pago assistant. We have now one that starts to have a conversation with you. It's a little star inside Mercado Pago. And then you can start having a conversation about, let's transfer this money to Damian and all of that. And I think it's just the beginning, but I'm very hopeful that over the next year, we will continue to develop things that still keep Mercado Libre at the center of the life of the consumers. And it needs to be using our data to hyper-personalize your experience. If we fail on that, someone else will take that spot, but it would be our game to lose.
But everyone's using Claude Cowork, but your margins have fallen to 7%. So I guess, and you still have 60 people, roughly speaking, working in your team, not less, since you applied Claude Work and got rid of NHN and so on. So why do you, to make it very tangible and real, why do you still need 60 people if Claude Cowork is making everyone so much more productive?
Because we are growing at 49%. So basically my 60 people are doing things that, we will need 80 by now. I guess that we are in a very privileged position in which we have so much growth, that there is so much work going around that, those 60 people, I can get them very busy with all the extra work that is coming their way. So you don't need to get into scenarios of potentially saying, well, I did 50 now and not 60. But even in that scenario in which we're absorbing far more work, doing more with the same people, I think that we are still, from a numbers perspective, and this happens across the industry, probably the first quarter, each of us had an explosion in the AI cost in tokens. And still, as I was saying before, I think the system still needs to realize the big productivity gains that come from AI, right? So basically, over the next 2-3 years, I think there is a huge work around, call it rewiring the organization, changing the way we operate. Maybe the spans of control that we have for people don't make sense, right? Teams were assembled to manage humans, and now you can have humans and agents. So you need to think about the spans of controls in a different way. It's like rearranging the factory in a way. And I heard that probably the best example was when the steam engine was replaced by electric engines in the workshops, and how that changed the layout. And at the beginning, nothing much changed, and the productivity gain was not there. I think we have, again, ahead of us 2 or 3 years of huge change in the way we work. And I don't have a doubt that that will be seen in margins. And those 60 people, to put in an example, will be doing probably going to be the same 60 people in 3 years, but with 3 or 4 times the size of Mercado Libre. And I think that's what we are betting, that that's going to be the case. And that's what we're working on. But it requires not only having Claude Cowork installed in your computer, it requires all these other things of change management, which I think is the most difficult part.
Leandro, that was completely fascinating. Thank you so much again for your time. And if both of us are in the same jobs in a year's time, hope you join us in June 2027.
You've got a deal. Thank you very much.
Well, that's it for this week's Mex Moves. We hope to continue listening to your suggestions, criticisms. Please share us, and we hope to have you back next week.